Every year, millions of people walk through the Metropolitan Cathedral in Mexico City. They light candles, they take photos, some of them pray. Almost none of them know they're standing on top of a god the builders tried to erase. Not buried by time, not lost to an earthquake or a fire. Buried on purpose by men who knew exactly what was underneath and built on top of it anyway. This is the story of Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and of war, the reason the Aztec capital existed where it did at all, and the story of how we know anything about him now, filtered through the exact people who tried to make sure we wouldn't. To understand why a cathedral sits on top of a temple, you have to understand that the temple came first, and it wasn't an afterthought. It was the reason this city existed. According to Aztec tradition, Huitzilopochtli was the god who told the Mexica people where to settle, where they'd see an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a snake. That image is still on the Mexican flag today. Think about that for a second. This isn't some forgotten deity nobody's heard of. His origin myth is printed on a national flag that flies over government buildings right now. It's a little like if the founding story of a country you knew was, on some level, still stitched into its currency or its flag, except here, almost nobody clocks it as a religious claim anymore. It's just the flag. Huitzilopochtli wasn't a background figure in the Aztec pantheon. He was closer to a head of state. War, the sun's daily survival, the empire's right to exist, all of it ran through him. The Templo Mayor, the twin-staired pyramid at the heart of Tenochtitlan, had one side dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and one to Tlaloc, the rain god. War and agriculture, the two things an empire cannot survive without. By the early 1500s, this temple sat at the center of a city of over 200,000 people, bigger than most European capitals at the time. London wasn't there yet. This was the real thing. Then, in 1521, the Spanish under Hernán Cortés took the city after a brutal siege, and what they did next wasn't just conquest, it was architectural erasure. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable, and it's the same problem you run into again and again when you go looking for the real version of a suppressed god. Almost everything we know about Huitzilopochtli in his own people's words doesn't come from before the conquest. It comes from after. And I mean decades after. The main source, the single most detailed account of Aztec religion, ritual, and daily life that exists, is something called the Florentine Codex. It was compiled by a Spanish Franciscan friar named Bernardino de Sahagún, starting around the 1540s and finishing in the 1570s. That's roughly 50 years after the fall of the empire it describes. Sahagún interviewed elderly indigenous informants, men who had grown up under the old religion, and had them work with trilingual former students to write everything down in Nahuatl with Spanish translation alongside. On paper, that sounds like careful ethnography. In practice, it's a document produced by a Catholic missionary for a Catholic institution, using memories that were half a century old, from a generation that had lived through the systematic destruction of the very thing they were being asked to describe. It's a bit like trying to reconstruct a language from the testimony of the last few elderly speakers, taken down by the very government that had spent decades punishing people for speaking it. You'd get something real. You'd also get something shaped, consciously or not, by what felt safe to say, and what the person writing it down was primed to hear. And here's the part that makes it worse. While Sahagún was carefully interviewing and preserving, other Spanish authorities were doing the opposite. Bishop Diego de Landa, working in the Yucatan around the same period, ordered the burning of Maya codices, by his own account, dozens of them in a single event in 1562. The Aztec region saw similar campaigns. Pre-conquest pictorial manuscripts, the actual first-hand visual records made by people who lived the religion, were treated as heretical objects to be destroyed, not preserved. So the accounting looks like this. The primary sources were burned. The secondary source, the one we actually rely on, was produced 2 generations later by the same institution that did the burning, for the express purpose of documenting a religion it had already declared false. That doesn't mean the Florentine Codex is worthless. Historians and archaeologists still treat it as an extraordinary document. It's detailed, it's cross-referenced against archaeology, and Sahagún, by the standards of his century, was unusually rigorous. But unusually rigorous for a 16th century friar is a very different thing from an unfiltered Aztec voice. Every page passed through a Catholic lens before it reached paper. While the Florentine Codex was being compiled, the Spanish were also making a very literal decision about what to do with the temple itself. They didn't just abandon the Templo Mayor, they dismantled it, pulled stones from the pyramid to build the new colonial city on top of it, including, eventually, the Metropolitan Cathedral itself, constructed over the following 2 centuries, directly adjacent to and partially over the temple precinct. It's worth sitting with that. This wasn't a city that grew up somewhere else and happened to bury an old ruin under new construction over the centuries, the way, say, London sits on layers of Roman street. This was a deliberate act. Take the stones of the god's house and put them into the walls of the new one. Imagine losing a war and then watching the winning side literally build their new headquarters out of the bricks of your Capitol building. That's not erasure by neglect. That's erasure as architecture. By the 18th century, the Templo Mayor wasn't a ruin people could see anymore. It wasn't even really a memory. It was just under the street, under a cathedral, government buildings, city blocks. For almost 250 years, Mexico City simply existed on top of it, and most people had no idea it was there at all. On February 21, 1978, electrical company workers were digging in downtown Mexico City. Routine utility work, nothing to do with archaeology at all. Their equipment struck something hard, several feet down. Stone, carved stone. What they'd hit was a massive circular relief, over 3 meters across, depicting a dismembered, decapitated female figure. This was the Coyolxauhqui stone, the moon goddess, sister of Huitzilopochtli, shown in the exact moment of her death in the central myth of his birth, the myth where he's born fully armed and kills her at the base of the sacred mountain. Archaeologists were brought in almost immediately, led by Eduardo Matos Moctezuma. What they found, once excavation began in earnest, wasn't a fragment. It was the base of the Templo Mayor itself, largely intact, layered with multiple stages of rebuilding across centuries, sitting exactly where colonial-era accounts had suggested it might be, but which no one had ever confirmed. For nearly 250 years, people had walked over the actual temple, going to work, going to church, without knowing it was still down there. Not destroyed, not lost. Just paved over and forgotten, the same way the god himself had been paved over in the historical record, present the entire time, waiting for someone to dig in the right spot. Today you can visit the site. It sits a few dozen meters from the cathedral that was partly built from its own stones. You can stand at street level in modern Mexico City and look straight down into the 1400s. So the next time you see a photo of the Metropolitan Cathedral in Mexico City, or if you ever stand in the Zócalo yourself, remember what's actually underneath your feet. A god the Spanish tried to erase through conquest, through burned codices, through stones repurposed into a new religion's walls, and who came back into the light because of a utility crew laying an electric cable 500 years later. Not because anyone meant to remember him. Because you can bury a god under a cathedral. You can't always keep him there.